For my story circle assignment, I focused on Richard Wagamese's Indian Horse. This is a 200-page novel by Richard Wagamese that was published in 2012 by Douglas and McIntyre Press. The story is written as the fictional memoir of the character of Saul Indian Horse and chronicles his experiences growing up in Northern Ontario during the 1950s and 1960s. At the start of the story, when we meet Saul, he's actually at the New Dawn Center, which is a rehabilitative facility for alcoholics, and he is sharing with the reader his journey, his healing journey. Thus, a key theme that emerges right from the start concerns the power of stories as it relates to healing. To offer you a little bit of background, Saul grew up in the bush in Northern Ontario with his grandmother Naomi and his parents, who were survivors of the residential school system. His parents actually turned to drinking when their eldest son Benjamin returned, actually having escaped from a residential school, and then dies. He's abandoned with his grandmother in the dead of the winter in the northern bush. At that point, his grandmother dies while holding him to shelter him from the cold blizzard, and his life is changed forever. For at that point, he's taken by some white people to a residential school called St. Jerome's Indian Residential School, which is located in White River, Ontario. And it's at that point that the story of Saul changes, for escape from loneliness and suffering comes through hockey. I have to admit, when I first picked up this story, I questioned my department head's choice for including a novel about hockey in an all-girls school. I had doubts as to whether I would even enjoy such a novel. While hockey is linked with Canadian and with national identity, I have to confess my knowledge of hockey was limited to growing up in an Italian neighborhood where young boys and adolescents would play with tennis balls and hockey sticks on the street in the summer. Girls were never invited to join the team. However, so much has changed since the late 1980s and 90s, and today I know that young women enjoy great triumph on the rink, both with the success of the Canadian women's national ice hockey team and by all the numerous amateur and professional hockey leagues for women across Canada. Hockey is of critical importance in this story, and the passages about hockey are amongst the most beautiful in the story. A key symbol that emerges in the story is the hockey puck. Hockey puck, in its circular form, represents Saul's life journey, the cycles through his life and his journey through deprivation, salvation, isolation, and healing. For Aboriginal people, the circle represents life and growth, and likewise, the puck in this story is a symbol of the different stages of Saul's growth. It is through hockey that he finds love and acceptance, but it is also through hockey, as I will elaborate, that he experiences isolation and suffering. Saul's experiences and growth can thus be understood through the game of hockey, which at once offers him salvation and suffering. And the way I've organized this presentation, as well as my literary essay, is around 4 key points related to hockey. So I've started with discussing darkness and deprivation at St. Jerome's, the Indian residential school, hockey as a shining light at St. Jerome's, hockey and isolation, and finally I conclude with hockey and healing. When Saul first arrives at St. Jerome's Indian residential school, he describes it as hell on earth. He even says, I read once that there are holes in the universe that swallow all light, all bodies. St. Jerome's took all the light from my world. In these examples, Wagamese uses the light and dark motif to develop this theme of deprivation at St. Jerome's and to really emphasize the dehumanizing effects of the residential school. As I mentioned earlier, St. Jerome's is the setting of the residential school, and it's located in White River, which is a community between Thunder Bay and Sault Ste. Marie. It's also known as, ironically, the birthplace of Winnie the Pooh. Saul is at St. Jerome's Indian Residential School from the age of 8 to 13, and in his time there, as he recalls his time there, his description of the children who had been broken or died at St. Jerome's are almost telegraphic in style and devoid of any emotion. For example, he says of one young boy who died, They found him hanging from the rafters of the barn on a cold February morning. He'd wrapped his own hands behind his back with twists of rope before he jumped. At no point does Saul share his own emotional reaction to this suicide. In chapter 14 of the novel, instead, Saul uses a parallel structure to emphasize his emotional detachment. And the chapter, which is the shortest in the novel, actually sounds more like a list. Every sentence in that chapter begins with the words, I saw. So in an instance that I have just cited here, Saul says, I saw young boys and girls die standing on their own 2 feet. I saw runaways carried back frozen, solid as boards. I saw bodies hung from rafters on thin ropes. To survive this hardship, Saul withdraws. He withdraws in solitude, and he becomes void of any emotion. Yet despite this attempt to remain invisible, he does mourn the loss of his family, his connection to the land, and his old life. In one example, he is with a group of children in a rare unsupervised moment, and they're by a creek. They are playing with fish, catching them, and releasing them. At one point, the children look at the fish, and he states, we stood quietly, each of us lost in our thoughts, as the fish struggled for air, for life, for freedom. When we finally bent and took the fish in our hands to set them back into the water, most of us were crying. In this example, we see Saul actually mourning the loss of his childhood, the loss of his family, and the loss of his life. Things shift in Saul's life with the introduction of a new character, Father Gaston Le Boutelier. Father Le Boutelier, as he's affectionately called by Saul, is the one who introduces the game of hockey to Saul. He's also the first character to show Saul any love and affection. At one point, Saul recalls, his warm hand made me think of my grandmother's touch. In another instance, he says, I almost cried for the memory of my father. Despite Saul's hardened survival skills, what Wagamese is actually hinting at here with the introduction of this character is Saul's vulnerability. For Saul, hockey becomes a means of escape and a survival from the horrors of St. Jerome's. He actually dreams about playing hockey, and he thinks about hockey at every free moment he has. When others are asleep, Saul actually stands in the aisle in between the cots and mimes the action of stick handling and of scoring a goal. Here is an example of one of the reveries he has. He says, I'd snap my wrists and send the puck in a blur high into the right-hand corner, bulging the twine between the helpless goaltender. Naturally, the force of the shot would take me to one knee. I would raise my arms in the hushed light of the dorm. My mouth would be open with glee, and I would face the picture of Jesus hung there on the wall. My salvation coming instead through the wood and rubber and ice and the dream of the game. Then I'd climb back into bed and sleep until the dawn woke me, and I could walk back out to the rink again. In actuality, Saul is at this point playing with frozen horse turds. And the frozen horse turds are very symbolic. They're shaped like a circular puck. They're also very fragile, and they break easily. Saul has to handle them with care. The horse turds actually symbolize Saul's vulnerability, and thus the danger he puts in trusting Father Le Boutelier, who dangles a rubber hockey puck in front of him, promising him that he will one day play the game. Saul is so enamored by this dream of one day playing the game that he will do anything to achieve it. And he talks about the game, describing the white glory of the rink and a snow-white stage. To Saul, the game equals freedom, purity. It equals everything beautiful, and he clings to that. Indeed, Saul personifies the game of hockey. When Father Le Boutelier pats him on the back and says, the game loves you, Saul, after a particularly successful match, Saul reflects and says, right there, right then, I knew it back. I loved it back. It's also through the game of hockey that he has his first confrontations with racism from the outside world. In one instance, when they are playing a white team that is not from a residential school, players actually refuse to play against him because he is so talented and because he is an Aboriginal player. And Saul reflects, they think it's their game. At the age of 13, Saul is adopted by Fred and Martha Kelly, an Ojibwe couple who used to live at St. Jerome's and now run a hockey team called the Moose that is composed of native players in the town of Manitouwadge. On the team, he experiences great success. In fact, the team is so successful, and he is the star of the team, that they are invited to play against white hockey teams. At first, Saul is hesitant to do this. He recalls his experience while at the residential school, but he doesn't want to let the Moose down and eventually agrees to the competition. He says in one reflection, "We arrived in those towns as hockey players, expecting to play a square game, stick to stick, end to end, fair and equal. But they only ever saw us as Indians." In another example, in the town of Chapleau, the team goes to eat at a cafe after a game, and it is there that every player is beat up and peed upon, except Saul, who is spared the humiliation. The white players reiterate, "This is our game." While the Moose once experienced the love and joy of the game, they now begin to fight on the ice. They're invited to numerous invitational games against white players because of the great talent that Saul brings to the game. But every game results in a fight, and Saul, he refuses to fight on the ice. He tells us, "They wanted me to bare my fists and fight, but I would not do that. I would not surrender my vision of the game. I would not let go of my dream of it, the freedom, the release it gave me, the joy it gave me. It wasn't anybody else's game to take from me." This tells us the extent of Saul's connection from the game. It also tells us of what's happening in the story at this point and the isolation that he and the Moose are experiencing as native players wanting to play the game. Indeed, because he refuses to fight, Saul is called Chief Chicken. He is taunted with racist taunts such as, "Engines are supposed to wear war paint, not makeup." In thinking about these aspects of the game, I actually started thinking back to the Molson beer commercial in the year 2000, the I Am Canadian commercial that featured Joe, the white Western Canadian, proudly exclaiming, "Canada is the first nation of hockey." And in thinking back to this commercial and in thinking back to my identity as Canadian and growing up in this country, I really thought about how hockey is a manifestation of belonging in Canada, and it is an expression of Canadian identity. And what Saul experiences is marginalization. He is an outsider. Even when he is recruited by the Toronto Marlies to play the game, he realizes it is the white man's game. So hockey at this point becomes a symbol of the white man and of his inability to access this world. Saul's talents are so incredible indeed that he is recruited by the Marlies, as I just mentioned. And despite his great talents on the ice, he's constantly taunted by the press and by the fans with racist taunts because of his native identity, once again really reminding him and highlighting that he does not belong. He reflects in one instance, "When I hit someone, it wasn't just a body check. I was counting coups. When I made a dash down the ice and brought the crowd to their feet, I was on a raid. If I inadvertently high-sticked someone during a tussle in the corner, I was taking scalps. When I did not react to getting a penalty, I was the stoic Indian." One reporter described how I looked flying across the opposition blue line with the puck on my stick. "I was as bright-eyed as a painted warrior bearing down a wagon train." In thinking about this, I thought about all the stereotypes that were just mentioned in that reflection and all the stereotypes that Saul was confronted with in his journey. At this point, he's the only native player on the Marlies. While he's successful in having achieved this placement on the team, he is now far away from the Moose, far away from other native players and other native people, and instead he's living in loneliness and isolation, confronted on a daily basis with stereotypes. At one point it becomes too much for him, and he actually fights back and declares, "If they wanted me to be a savage, that's what I would give them." He starts to act like the stereotype the papers paint him out to be, one night dropping to one knee at the other team's blue line and actually miming taking a shot at the net with a bow and arrow. At this point, Saul abandons playing the game and becomes a drifter, moving from town to town, drinking continuously, and almost dying from alcoholism.